Well, I am Ramana Ali and today I am going to discuss a lesson of intermediate second year. The name of the unit is plant physiology. Here the word physiology means study of metabolic activities, or we can say life processes. So the life processes includes digestion, respiration, excretion and many other processes which regulates in our body. Similarly, these life processes or the metabolic activities which takes place in the plant, the study of the metabolic activities and the life processes which occurs in the plant body is termed as plant physiology. So under this unit, let us talk about the first chapter, that is transport in plants. Firstly, we need to see that how many substances need to be transported through the various cells of the plant or through the various cells in a plant body. So there are three different substances which needs to be transported in a plant body, and they are: the first one is water, which needs to be transported, the second is minerals, and the third one is food. This food is synthesized by the leaves and it is going to be transported to the various storage cells and to the other cells wherever the food is required. So these materials are transported in a plant body by various processes. If we talk about how much the distance these materials need to be transported in a plant body, then it is of two types. There are short distance transport and the other one is long distance transport. This type, short distance transport, occurs within the cells. If these materials need to be transported within the cells or from one cell to another cells, or for a shorter distance, then the materials like water, minerals and food are going to be transported to the shorter distance, that is within the cells or from one cell to another cell, by some processes like diffusion and cytoplasmic movements. So the cytoplasmic movements, the circular movements of the cytoplasm makes the materials like water, minerals and food to be transported to a shorter distance within a plant body. When we talk about the long distance transport, you can see that in a big or the huge trees, the water which is absorbed by the root hairs need to get transported till the top of the tree. So for this type of transport, some vesicular tissues are present in the plant body, and these vesicular tissues are of two types. They are xylem and phloem. Xylem are the vesicular tissues or the conductive tissues which helps in the conduction or the absorption of the water from the root hairs till the tip of the tree, and phloem are the conductive tissues which helps in the conduction of food material which is prepared by the leaves during photosynthesis. So in this way, the xylem is used for the conduction of water and phloem is used for the conduction of food material. The transport of the materials in a plant body to travel long distance, this long distance transport which is achieved by the vesicular tissues like xylem and phloem is called as translocation. So in this way, short distance transport and long distance transport takes place in a plant body. Now let us see the various means by which the materials are transported in a plant body. There are two means by which the materials are getting transported in the plant body, and they are passive transport and the other one is active transport. Passive transport, it is a type of transport in which the energy is not required. No energy expenditure takes place in the process or in the passive type of transport. But in the active transport, the energy or the ATP molecules are required, but we can say it is must in the active transport. So in the active transport, if ATP is not consumed, if energy is not available, then the active transport could not take place in the plant body. In passive transport, it is a process in which the molecules from a region of higher concentration moves to the region of lower concentration. And when we talk about active transport, the molecules moves against the concentration gradient. Now to understand the definitions of passive transport and the active transport, we can see one example. This is a cell, and if 100 molecules are present which needs to be transported inside the cell. So through the passive transport, 50 molecules will be present outside of the cell and 50 molecules will enter the cell. So it is showing that through passive transport, where the energy is not consumed, 50% of the molecules will be present outside of the cell and 50% of the molecules will get transported inside the cell without any expenditure of energy, and this type of transport is called as passive transport, and the molecules enter into the cell till it reaches the equilibrium. Means the molecules which are present outside should be equal to the molecules which are present inside. So in this way, it is a process in which the molecules moves from a region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration till it reaches the equilibrium. When we see the active transport, suppose 100 molecules are present outside of this cell. So through active transport, where energy is required and it is against the concentration gradient, 80 molecules can go inside and 20 molecules will remain outside. So in this way, active transport is a process which is against the concentration gradient. And the next difference between the passive transport and the active transport is passive transport is not sensitive to inhibitors. Now, what is the meaning of inhibitors? Inhibitors are the substances which have the capability to stop the function of the enzymes, that are called inhibitors. So the passive transport is not sensitive to inhibitors. It occurs irrespective of the inhibitors. When we talk about the active transport, it is sensitive to temperature as well as inhibitors. How it is sensitive to temperature and inhibitors? Let's see. We know that in active type of transport, energy is required, ATP is required. So in active transport, along with the ATP, some enzymes and proteins are taking place for transporting the materials. So if the temperature is high, then these proteins can be denatured. Whereas if the inhibitors are present in the active type of transport, then they can inhibit or stops the function of the enzymes. So in this way, the active transport is sensitive to temperature as well as to the inhibitors. Now we will study about the processes which comes under the passive type of transport. So the first type of passive transportation, so the first process is diffusion. Diffusion is a process which is the passive type, and it is defined as the movement of the solute particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration till it reaches the equilibrium. As we have already studied in the passive type of transport, that the solid particles move from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration till it reaches the equilibrium. So this is called as diffusion. Diffusion takes place between the gases and also between the liquids. But diffusion in the solid particle is not possible because of the density of the solid particles. Diffusion of the solid particles can take place sometimes, but diffusion in the solid particles cannot occur because of their density. And as the diffusion is a passive type of transport, it do not require energy and no ATP consumption takes place in the process diffusion. Now we will see the factors that affect the rate of diffusion. So the first one is temperature. If the temperature is increases, the rate of the diffusion will become more faster. For example, the heat or the cooked food, we can smell the cooked food easily when compared to the refrigerated food, because the heat or the cooked food shows when we heat the cooked food, the heat energy is getting converted into kinetic energy, and these particles can be trapped to the greater distances. That is the reason if the temperature is increases, the rate of the diffusion will also get increases. So if the temperature is increases, diffusion become faster. The next factor which affects the rate of diffusion is density. In our lower classes, you have already studied about the Graham's law. So according to the Graham's law, the diffusion is inversely proportional to the root of density. This equation shows that if the particle has a greater density, then it cannot move to the greater distance. Therefore, the diffusion is inversely proportional to the root of density. So if the density is more, the rate of the diffusion is less. If the density is less, the rate of the diffusion becomes faster. The third factor is concentration gradient. Here if the concentration gradient is increases, the rate of the diffusion becomes faster. Let's see one example. If we take a tank filled with water and we are pouring some crystals of potassium permanganate in one corner of the tank, and we can see that other corners of the tank do not possess that particles. So it's showing that in one corner the higher concentration is present, whereas the other corners no concentration or the lower concentration of the particle is present. So in this situation the particles diffuses more faster against the concentration gradient. The concentration gradient is increases, the diffusion will also be increased. The next factor which affects the rate of diffusion is surface area. If the surface area to carry out the transportation is more, then the rate of the diffusion will increases and it will become faster. For example, when we see the alveoli of the lungs, it provides 100 square meter of area for the exchange of gases. The greater surface area helps the rate of the diffusion to occur more faster and it increases the rate of diffusion. So these are some of the factors which affects the rate of diffusion. Now let us study about the other type of passive transport, that is facilitated diffusion. When we learn about facilitated diffusion, we need to understand the two terms, that are facilitated and diffusion. We have already discussed about the process diffusion, which is a passive type of transport and which occurs in the absence of energy, means which do not require any ATP to carry out. So if the diffusion is carried out or is facilitated by some proteins, then it is called as facilitated diffusion. And we know the molecules which needs to get transported are getting transported or are getting enter into the cells. So the plasma membrane is made up of phospholipids, and the plasma membrane shows some proteins inside and some proteins outside. The proteins which are present outside are called as extrinsic proteins, and the proteins which are found inside the membrane are known as intrinsic proteins. So these proteins helps in carrying the molecules which needs to get transported inside the cell. So let's see how it's getting transported inside the cell. This one is our molecule, and if this molecule needs to move or needs to enter into the cell, these proteins which are present outside the membrane binds with the molecule. Then after binding with the molecule, it enters into the cell, leaves that molecule or release that molecule inside the cell, and then this protein again come back to its place. So this type of diffusion which occurs or which is facilitated by the carrier proteins is called as facilitated diffusion. And when the carrier protein binds with the molecule, enters into the plasma membrane, then it enters into the cell, releases that particle, and then the protein comes back to its original position. So this process do not require any ATP or any energy, hence it is called as passive type of transport. We have seen that in facilitated diffusion, carrier proteins are involved, and these carrier proteins are transporting the particles or the molecules inside the cell. So the carrier proteins are of two types, porins and aquaporins. The porins are the proteins which makes the pores in the cell membrane, and through that pores they carry the particles from the outside into the cell, and these particles are getting transported through porins by making the pores. Porins make the pores in the cell membrane of mitochondria. We can see the porins attached to the cell membrane of the mitochondria, and it also present on the cell membrane of plastids. Porins can also be found on the membrane of some bacteria. The next protein is aquaporins. As the name itself suggests that it helps in water transport. As the aquaporins are helping in transporting the water material into the plant body, it is also called as water channels. So these are the carrier proteins which helps the substances to move into the cell from the outside. And when we see the particles are of two types which needs to get transported. It may be polar or non-polar. We can take the examples of ions like Na plus and Cl minus under polar particles, and the non-polar particles includes amino acids and nucleosides. Facilitated diffusion shows three ways by which the molecules or the particles are getting inside the cell. The first is unipode. In this type, the carrier proteins are carrying the carrier proteins carrying only one particle inside the cell. Only one particle is getting transported inside the cell through carrier proteins, and this type of transport is known as unipode. The second one is sympode, and in this type this carrier protein is helping to transport two molecules at a time. Two molecules A and B, let us take A and B. These two molecules or the particles are getting transported by this carrier protein inside the cell in the same direction. And the third one is antipode. Here we can see that the carrier protein is transporting two different molecules in opposite direction. The movement of the particles in an opposite direction. Here we can take the example of calcium ions. The calcium ions are getting transported into the reticulum, into the sarcoplasmic reticulum through unipode, where the calcium ions are moving in one direction through a carrier protein. Whereas we take an example of sodium ions and glucose under sympode. Let us take A as sodium ions and B as glucose. So, the sodium ions and the glucose are getting transported inside the transported to the intestine through sympode. That is, it moves in one direction. The carrier protein takes these particles in the same direction. And under antipode, we can take the examples of sodium ions and potassium ions. And here it uses one molecule of the ATP, and it shows that three sodium ions are moving outside, resulting in the movement of the potassium ions inside the cell. Hence, it shows that the two different molecules are getting transported in two different directions. Therefore, we can see that the sodium ions are transported outside the cell membrane, and the potassium ions are coming inside the cell membrane. Two potassium ions are allowed to get inside the cell by the release of one ATP molecule. So, this is about the unipode, sympode and antipode. Unipode shows the movement of only one particle in one direction. Sympode shows the two particles which moves in the same direction, and antipode shows the movement or the transportation of the two different particles in an opposite direction. So, till now we have discussed about the passive transport and the different processes under the passive transport, and there are diffusion and facilitated diffusion. The remaining topics I am going to discuss in my next class.